Has Deleuze's thought run out of steam? Has the current spate of Deleuze literature, with all its monographs and articles on Deleuze and cinema, Deleuze and ecology, Deleuze and mathematics, Deleuze and aliens, Deleuze and vampires, and so on, has this spate of literature got lost in what Deleuze called the dramatizations of philosophy, the figurations, and we're missing the purity of the Deleuze in all these Deleuze and X. On the other hand, we might get the impression that when people try to expound Deleuze's philosophy in a purer form, that they may get caught up in what is basically a conceptual instantiation of Deleuze's thought. There always seems to be something missing and some sort of enigma as to why Deleuze chose to talk about difference and then basically dropped it in logic of sense, why Deleuze with Guattari decided to talk about desiring machines and then basically dropped that concept in A Thousand Plateaus and took up the notion of assemblage instead. So we can wonder whether there is something more radical in Deleuze's thought outside the dramatizations and figurations and outside the systematic or conceptual instantiations. That is a sort of question that Francois Laruelle asked himself basically in the 80s, and I'm doing a video book, a reader's guide to Laruelle's A Biography of Ordinary Man, to think through with the book, not necessarily agreeing with it. I'm by no means a Laruellian, but to think through his project and what I would call his thought experiment. Laruelle had similar sorts of questions, and in 1985 he published this book, A Biography of Ordinary Man, which was translated into English only 3 years ago. And so basically what he does in this book is that he isolates two conflicting or superposable philosophies that occur within the overall meta-research program of, at that time, contemporary French thought that included Lyotard, Derrida, Deleuze, Michel Serres, Badiou, and others that maybe we know less about today, like Costas, Axelos, and even more. And Laruelle found an agon, if you will, between what he called the philosophies of difference and another philosophy which he thought deeper and more powerful, and that's the philosophy of multiplicities. So if we're at all interested in, involved in Deleuze's thought, we might come to see that there's some plausibility in that idea. Deleuze developed a philosophy of multiplicities in relation with Bergson and Hume and Nietzsche. And then in Difference and Repetition, he expressed this philosophy of multiplicities in terms of the structuralist and quasi-structuralist concepts that were being analyzed by everyone at that time. And I would argue that this philosophy of difference is just one instantiation of the philosophy of multiplicities. And we see that when, in Logic of Sense, Deleuze drops almost all reference to difference and repetition and comes back to disengaging the pure notion of the transcendental plane of multiplicities. He does all sorts of other things with it, and it's a book full of dramatizations and figurations. But that's one of the key moves that Deleuze does in this book. So we have philosophy of multiplicities, difference and repetition, philosophy of difference, logic of sense, disengaging the transcendental plane of multiplicities in as pure a form as possible, and then applying it to all sorts of domains. Then maybe he goes back to the transcendental plane to be capable of seeing a possible relation between his thought and Guattari's thought. And then the instantiation is in the theory of desiring machines in Anti-Oedipus, that is full of dramatizations with all sorts of conceptual personae or conceptual characters. And they only really come back to disengaging the transcendental plane in its purity, which they call in what is philosophy, which they call the transcendental field. And thanks to that fully disengaged transcendental field, they're able to sort of look backwards and give a theory of what they were doing and what Deleuze was doing in earlier works, and I suppose Guattari as well, in terms of conceptual characters and landscapes that are these instantiations and figurations of the transcendental field of multiplicities. So in 1985, Laruelle saw this, if it's not a conflict, it's a up and down pulsation between the philosophy of multiplicity and the philosophy of difference. And he says, let's try a thought experiment. Let's take away all the examples, all the figurations, all the dramatizations, as much as possible. I would argue that he can never fully succeed in totally eliminating them, and that's a Deleuzian point. And he says, let's take away the instantiations. The most powerful instantiation for him at that moment is the philosophy of difference. So he says, let's take away the philosophy of difference and go to the most radical idea and try to push it as radically as possible. And that's the theory of multiplicities, that he calls the theory of minorities as well, but it's not the empirical minorities that we might want to give as examples. And his idea is just to pursue that pure thought of multiplicities and see what it is in itself, and what, looking at philosophy from within that theory of multiplicities, what perspective that can give on philosophy as it has been practiced up to then and as it has been instantiated in the different philosophies of Deleuze, Lyotard, Derrida, Serre, and Badiou and Axelos. So I'm producing this video book, which is an ongoing reading of a biography of ordinary man, and thinking it through with this idea of Deleuze's philosophy in mind, to see the validity and pertinence that Laruelle's book may have to Deleuze's philosophy as it's expressed, and to see if he really does succeed in isolating out the radical strand in such a way as to make it usable in our time, and so that we can finally free ourselves from the sort of constant repetition of Deleuzian themes and examples, and get on to a more thinking approach to what's happening in the world today.